Why you have to make all these excuses for her? This, like I said, all this was this week was people who said, "Oh, she ran a flawless campaign. How ridiculous!" Or it's sexism, it's racism. This is an old playbook.
Yes, I didn't say any of those things.
I know, but I've heard a lot of these things, and I think America's perfectly willing to elect a woman. They just didn't like the last two that were put up.
All right, get ready, because today we're diving straight into one of the most ridiculous political blame games we've seen in years, and that's saying a lot. We're talking about the media's total meltdown over Kamala Harris losing the election to Donald Trump. And more specifically, about the excuses pouring out of MSNBC like they're flowing from ATAP.by now. You'd expect them to move on. You'd think maybe they'd switch up the narrative, ditch the old "it's sexism, it's racism" routine for something new. But no, same tired script, just repackaged. And honestly, Bill Maher wasn't having it. He called it out loud and clear. And I'm here for it. So let's rewind.
But you're either the person who's Googling the day before, did Biden drop out, or in a week. Did anyone in this audience not know enough about Kamala Harris pretty much after a week to make a decision?
All week long, pundits have been on TV saying Kamala's campaign was flawless. Flawless? Really? That's like saying New Coke was a marketing hit. Or that Cats, yes, the movie, was a masterpiece. Let's be real, this campaign wasn't flawless. It wasn't even close. And as that claim started falling apart, the backup excuses came out. Sexism, racism, and voter ignorance. Here's the truth. America is fully capable of electing a woman. We've just been given the wrong women to vote for in the last couple of cycles.
Sexism, it's racism. This is an old playbook.
Yes, I didn't say any of those things.
I know, but I've heard a lot of these things. And I think America's perfectly willing to elect a woman. They just didn't like the last two that were put up.
Let's be honest. This isn't the 1800s, we live in a time where Donald Trump dominated headlines for 8 years, sometimes without lifting a finger. You think Americans need a decade to get to know someone like Kamala. They didn't need it for Trump. They didn't need it for Obama. And they certainly didn't need it for Kamala.MSNBC, and their media friends don't want to face reality. But here it is. People did know Kamala. They just didn't like her. Period.
She was more popular in there.
Yes, well...
I mean, this idea that in a mass media age, that 107 days is not long enough to know somebody.
You are way overestimating the American people in terms of what they.
No.
You have someone like Donald Trump has become a universally known, understood, loved by some, hated by others over the course of being omnipresent for 8 years.
Now, let's talk about something Bill Maher pointed out: media silos. This is where it gets interesting. Yes, the political right has created its own media platforms now. But the idea of media silos didn't start with them. It started when the left took over traditional media outlets, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and used them as political shields. Bad news about Democrats? Spiked. Embarrassing clips? Cut out. Republican opponents? Turned into villains on repeat. 4 years, Trump was a punching bag of every news cycle. Meanwhile, Democrats got the friendly treatment. Soft lights, cozy interviews, and questions that sounded like they came from a greeting card. That's not journalism. That's PR. And people eventually caught on.
Funny, it used to be completely left. Then Elon said, I'm going to take it over, so it's going to be 50-50 right down the middle. He didn't do that. It just switched completely. So I don't know. It's terrible that I think that we have our own media silos. We need places where, like this show, but there's not enough of them, where everybody comes and everybody hears everybody else from all points of view.
That's why millions of people turn to independent voices. Podcasters like Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, and others who weren't afraid to call things like they saw them. They weren't pretending to be neutral. But they also weren't putting every story through a partisan filter. And guess what? Those platforms ended up having more influence on the election than all of legacy media combined. Which is kinda hilarious when you think about how hard the left worked to control the narrative. They had Twitter, the big headlines, the major networks, and still got outplayed by a bunch of guys recording podcasts in their garages.
I think the deeper question that the question's getting at is that if you look at the data in this election, the amount of reach of all of these alternative, I'm talking about the whole podcast space mostly, but also social media, the interviews that Trump did, not starting with Rogan, but Theo Vaughn and all of these other things he did, incredible reach compared to old mainstream media, right?
Then comes John Heilman, who says Twitter isn't a real place. Really? It was real enough when it was being used to ban news stories, silence accounts, and push one-sided political narratives. But now that Elon Musk owns it, suddenly it's a cesspool that doesn't matter. That's not having principles. That's just being bitter about losing control. And it shows, because every time the conversation edges close to admitting media bias, they start talking in circles. They wrap every half-truth in soft, careful language like they are tiptoeing barefoot across Lego bricks. You can see it hurts, but they refuse to scream.
Real place. That's sort of how I feel about Twitter. And Twitter, not only is Twitter not a real place, but it's become a toxic cesspool filled with nothing, not about right, it's not about conservative, it's just filled with misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. So I would rather not have the left replicate that if that's what's required.
Now, let's get to the inflation excuse. This one's wild. Heilman claims voters weren't really suffering economically. They just thought they were. That it was all about perception. Oh, really? Tell that to the family whose grocery bill has doubled. Tell it to the small business owner trying to survive while rent and utilities keep rising. Or the person staring at $4 plus gas and wondering how they'll fill their tank. This wasn't imagined. This was real. Gas prices went through the roof. Mortgage rates passed 7%. Wages stayed the same while everything else got more expensive. You didn't need a focus group to see things weren't working. You just needed to check your fridge and realize what was missing.
If you're the sitting vice president for a president who has, throughout his entire term in office, been sitting at about somewhere between a 35 and 40% approval rating. People view the Biden administration as a failure. We can have a long discussion about whether they are right about that, about the economy, but the perceptions of the economy were that people thought inflation was too high, people thought we were on the wrong track, 75% wrong track numbers, and this huge inflation overhang. You're the sitting vice president, and you get put on elevated to the top of the ticket 107 days ahead of the election. I think that is a very high degree of difficulty put on anybody, and I do not think she is the perfect candidate. I tend to agree with Sarah that probably in a fully litigated primary, she probably would not have been the Democratic nominee, but we'll never know that. But I will tell you that, there's never been anybody who's had the difficulty of that situation, elevated that late in the campaign. Why?
And now for the ultimate elitist take. When Heilman says 107 days wasn't enough time for voters to get to know Kamala, what he's really saying is, you're not smart enough to make a decision quickly. That's not just wrong, it's insulting. Voters didn't reject Kamala because they were confused. They rejected her because they were paying attention. And Bill Maher, again, hits back. He says, look, most countries run their elections in weeks. They don't need 2 years of rallies and commercials to figure out who's WHO.B by the end of the first week. Most people had already seen enough of Kamala to make up their minds. They saw the awkward laughing, the rambling answers, the lack of clarity. You don't need another year to figure out whether someone inspires confidence.
Barack Obama becomes president of the United States after running for 2 years as president, runs a 50-state primary, is on television, does dozens of Democratic debates, and by the time at the end of that, most people knew who he was. Most people. Yeah. You drop somebody into the middle of the top of the ticket, 3 days out, 3 months out. You are going to have to spend a lot of time trying to introduce yourself to the country while also being in a steel cage death match with Donald Trump.
Okay, but I don't know if you ever watched this show, but I had Michael Douglas on this week.
Yeah.
At the top, we were talking about this, and he made a very good point that every other country in the world can do it in months, sometimes weeks. Why can every other country do it in that short a period of time? Are they all so much brighter than America?
Still, Harmon keeps pushing the idea of late deciders, these mystery voters who supposedly walk into the booth without a clue. Bill Maher compares them to Christmas Eve shoppers, people who wait until the last possible minute.
Your contention is that no people were late deciders in the election.
No, they were. I talked about them last week. Christmas Eve shoppers.
So those people apparently needed longer than 90 days.
They would have been undecided.
They always would have been.
Exactly. That's why I call them. I called them, John, I said this last week, I called them Christmas Eve shoppers. My father was one. People who don't buy their presents until the Christmas Eve night. He would go into the store, and he wouldn't feel like he could do it until he was fully in the spirit. You had to be in the store on Christmas Eve with Santa and all the fucking elves and everything.
But here's the thing. Last-minute voters aren't uninformed. They are just careful that they've been paying attention. They know the candidates. They are just waiting to see who makes the strongest closing pitch. And if that pitch flops, it's not because voters needed more time. It's because the message didn't land. Next voice. Which brings us back to the heart of the matter. The media can spin this any way they like. They can say it was a flawless campaign. They can scream sexism. They can blame not enough time. But the truth is simple. People knew Kamala Harris. They heard her out, and they decided she wasn't the right choice.
You have to make all these excuses for her. This, like I said, all this was this week was people who said, "Oh, she ran a flawless campaign. How ridiculous!" Or "It's sexism. It's racism." This is an old playbook.
Yes, I didn't say any of those things.
I know, but I've heard a lot of these things, and I think America's perfectly willing to elect a woman. They just didn't like the last two that were put up.
That's not misogyny. That's not ignorance. That's democracy in action. And the sooner the DNC and their media allies stop blaming voters and start listening to them, the sooner they might start winning again. Until then, they are just going to keep losing and pointing the finger everywhere but at themselves. Next voice, next voice. So, what do you think? Was this really about timing? Or are Democrats just refusing to take responsibility? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Smash that like button if you're tired of the excuses, and make sure to subscribe. Because next time, we're talking about why the media is more afraid of losing control of the narrative than they are of losing elections. And trust me, that's when things start getting really messy.